the first thing I noticed was the sound. Not the usual noise of a rich house at night, no soft music, no clinking glasses. None of that. Everything is fine, luxury hum. This was lower, rougher, a vibration that didn't belong in a hallway with marble floors and framed art. A growl. It crawled up through the soles of my shoes like the building itself had a heartbeat, and it wanted something. I should have turned around right then. I should have taken my medical bag, walked back out the way I came, and told myself that no amount of money was worth stepping deeper into a place like this. But I wasn't here because I was brave. I was here because bravery looks a lot like desperation when you're a single mom and your kid's care costs more than your pride. My son Eli didn't need a hero. He needed prescriptions and follow-up visits and the kind of extras insurance always finds a way to call optional. I had done the math in my head so many times it played like a cruel lullaby. Rent, groceries, the car, the past due notice pinned to my fridge, then the appointment reminders, the co-pays, the new medication that came with a price tag that made my stomach drop. So when a number showed up on my phone that could keep Eli covered for another month, and the message said discreet overnight medical, no paperwork, no questions, I told myself I'd keep my eyes down and my hands steady and I'd leave before sunrise. I told myself a lot of things. The compound around me didn't feel like a normal estate. It felt like a decision, like someone had built it to make sure the world stopped at the gate. There were cameras that tracked you without blinking, lights placed in ways that made every shadow look guilty, men posted at corners like they'd been taught to become furniture until they needed to move. And there was a rule I'd heard in pieces even before my tires hit the long private drive. Stay away from the eastern courtyard after dark. I didn't hear it like gossip. I heard it like a warning people shared the way they share the location of black ice on a highway because you might be next, and they didn't want that on their conscience. The kind of warning delivered with a quick glance over the shoulder, a lowered voice, the same two words repeated like they were carved into stone. Eastern courtyard. I hadn't planned on going anywhere near it. My plan was simple. Do what I was hired for, keep it clean, keep it quiet, and get back to my real life before my son woke up wondering where I was. Then a guard, one of the younger ones, still wearing that tense, I'm trying to look unshakable, posture appeared at the end of the hall, and motioned like he wanted me to follow. He didn't speak to me like a person. He spoke to me like a tool that had been delivered, and I hated that I understood it so well. When you're broke long enough, you get used to being treated like you should be grateful for whatever crumbs you're handed. I followed anyway. Because money. Because Eli. Because I kept telling myself that a job is a job, and none of this had anything to do with me. The closer we got, the colder the air felt, even indoors. And then the hallway opened into a set of glass doors, and beyond them was darkness cut into sections by floodlights. Winter had a way of turning expensive landscaping into something eerie. Frozen grass, bare branches, stone paths that looked like they'd been scrubbed too clean. And there it was. The eastern courtyard. It wasn't a garden. It wasn't a pretty patio where people drank coffee. It was open and bare in a way that made it feel intentional. Like whoever designed it wanted nothing to hide behind. Like it was meant to be a stage. That's when I saw the dog. Onyx. I knew the name because I'd heard it in the same breath as the courtyard rule. People didn't talk about him like a pet. They talked about him like a problem you couldn't solve. He was huge black coat that swallowed light, shoulders built like a tank, head low, eyes the color of old amber catching the floodlights like tiny flames. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He simply stood there, coiled and still, the way a storm stands still right before it breaks. Around me, men stiffened. Not just the guard beside me, the ones farther back too. The ones who carried themselves like they'd seen worse than I ever would. Their hands moved in that automatic half-reach people do when they want control over something they don't control. I realized, with a sick clarity, that they were scared of their own dog. That told me everything. In the split second my brain tried to make sense of it, I remembered the little pieces people shared. A cane corso trained beyond obedient, trained past, protective, trained into something that didn't hesitate. A dog that didn't just guard a fence line, but claimed it. A dog that had sent grown men stumbling backward like they'd forgotten how legs worked. And then I saw the child. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A small shape moving in the light. Too small. Wrong, in a place like this. Like a mistake someone would correct immediately. But she kept walking. Ivy. I didn't know her name then. I only knew she looked about the age where my son still slept with one foot outside the blanket, as if even in dreams he needed a way out. Her coat was too big, sleeves swallowing her hands, held shut in a way that made my chest tighten because I recognized that kind of make it work. Her shoes didn't match. One step left a deeper print than the other, like she'd been collecting survival one piece at a time, and she was walking straight toward Onyx. Not drifting, not wandering, not stumbling like a lost kid who'd gotten turned around. She moved with purpose that didn't fit her size. That's what made my blood run cold. Because what kind of kid walks toward a monster like she's following a promise? The men around me reacted like they were trying not to set off a bomb. A ripple of motion, shoulders tightening, bodies shifting, someone reaching for something at their waist and stopping halfway like they'd realized how useless it would be. The air felt thick. My breath came too fast. Then I forced it slower, the way I do when a patient is spiraling and I need to be the calm in the room. Except the patient was me. I could taste adrenaline, metallic and bitter. And all I could think was, she's going to die right in front of me. And then he appeared. Declan Kane. You don't have to know a man's biography to recognize power when it steps into a space. It changes the room's posture. Even the guards turned a fraction toward him, like magnets aligning. He moved fast without looking rushed, controlled without looking relaxed. He didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. He didn't even need to look at anyone for them to understand what he wanted. I hated that my first thought wasn't about him. My first thought was that he was too far away. I watched him closing the distance in long strides, eyes locked on the courtyard. And I realized that even if he ran, even if all of them ran, they might still be seconds late. Because Ivy didn't slow. She didn't hesitate at the gate. She didn't glance around like she was checking for permission. She just kept going, breath steady, shoulders squared like she belonged in the forbidden place. Onyx's body shifted just a subtle change, weight rolling forward, muscles tightening along his back. The sound he made dropped lower, and every instinct in my body screamed to step between them. My hand tightened around my medical bag strap like it could turn into a shield. I knew it couldn't. I knew I was in the wrong place, with the wrong people, for the wrong reasons, and I still took one step forward because my brain could not accept standing still while a child walked into a kill zone. For one suspended moment, the world narrowed down to a few feet of frozen stone. A massive dog poised like a loaded weapon. A little girl who looked like Winter had been chewing on her for weeks. A man built of control moving too fast to keep control. And me, a mother with nothing but instinct and a bag of supplies, bracing to do something I hadn't thought through. Then Ivy crossed the final line close enough that I could see the tremble in her thin legs. Close enough that Onyx's shadow swallowed her shoes and it hit me like a punch that she wasn't afraid. Not the way she should have been. Her lips moved, and everything in that courtyard held its breath, right on the edge of whatever came next. For a split second, I really thought I was about to watch a child get torn apart. My brain started counting down the way it does in an emergency, not with numbers you say out loud, but with the tiny facts your body collects faster than your mind can pray. The distance between Ivy and Onyx, the way his shoulders rolled forward, the angle of his head, the quiet shift of boots behind me as the guards adjusted their stance, the sharp little clicks of safety mechanisms that felt pointless in the face of a dog that big and that trained. Declan Kane was still moving in, fast but controlled, like he believed control could bend time. I could feel him behind the glass and stone of the moment, a man used to being the final authority in every room. And still, he looked too far away. My hands had gone cold around the strap of my bag. My chest felt tight, like my ribs were trying to protect my heart from what it was about to see. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if I stepped forward, I would probably die too. And then I remember thinking something even clearer. If that were Eli out there, I wouldn't be standing here calculating odds. So my feet shifted. Just one step. Not heroic, not dramatic. Just the beginning of movement. The way you lean toward a crying baby before you even realize you've decided. That's when Ivy's lips moved. It wasn't a shout, not a command, not even something meant for all of us. It was small, private, a breath shaped into one single word that didn't carry far. I didn't hear it, not cleanly, not in a way I could repeat later. The courtyard swallowed sound in odd ways, and Onyx's growl had been filling the air like a wall. What I registered wasn't the word. It was what happened to the air right after it, like someone turned off a motor. The growl cut out. Not fading. Not easing. Just gone. Onyx froze so suddenly it looked painful. His whole body locked in the posture of attack. And then it softened. The tension drained out of him in a way I didn't know an animal could choose. His head dipped. His ears shifted, not forward like a weapon, but slightly back, like something that had been braced for impact was finally allowed to exhale. And then the impossible part, he lowered himself. This dog that everyone treated like a monster, This animal men with guns avoided like he was a live wire. Dropped down onto his belly as if he'd been given permission to stop being dangerous. His front legs folded neatly under him. His chest touched the cold stone. Not slow, not cautious. Fast, like obedience, like relief. He crawled forward. Not toward the guards, not toward Declan, toward the girl. His massive head went low, his neck stretching out until he was close enough that Ivy's tiny hand could reach him. And she did reach. No flinch, no hesitation. Just fingers disappearing into black fur like she'd done it before. Like she knew exactly where to touch. What kind of word turns a monster into a guardian? My mouth was open without sound. I couldn't tell if I wanted to laugh or cry or throw up. The guards didn't move, but I felt their confusion like heat at my back. Their weapons were still half raised, and now they didn't know where to aim their fear. Because Onyx didn't just submit. He changed sides. He shifted his body so his bulk was between Ivy and everyone else, including Declan, including the men who fed him, trained him, handled him, lived by his routine. His eyes tracked movement with the same sharp intensity as before, but the target had changed. It wasn't the child anymore. It was us. I saw the exact moment Declan realized it too. Not because he said anything he didn't need to. It hid in the way his posture tightened, in the smallest pause in his stride, in the way his gaze flicked from the dog to the girl and back again like the rules of his own house had just rearranged themselves. A crack. Tiny, but real. Declan Kane looked stunned, not scared in the way the guards were scared. More like a man watching the one thing he trusted without question suddenly make a decision without him. Like a weapon he'd counted on just refused to be held. I couldn't stop looking at Ivy's face. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't performing. She looked tired, honestly. Like someone who'd been walking too long in the cold. Like someone who had used up all her extra emotions weeks ago and was running on purpose alone. My fear didn't disappear. It just relocated. Because the danger was still there. Only now it was complicated. Onyx wasn't attacking Ivy. He was protecting her. And I didn't know what kind of protection this was. Gentle, loyal, terrified, possessive. I didn't know if one wrong move would flip him back into violence. I also didn't know how a child like that got here. How she found the only place on the property everyone avoided. How she walked straight into the line of death like she had a map in her head and a reason bigger than fear. I felt the adrenaline in my body shift into something else, something warmer and heavier. A mother's anger at the universe. A nurse's instinct to assess and stabilize. A woman's sudden awareness that I was standing in a world where rules were made by men like Declan. And yet a child had just rewritten one of the biggest rules in seconds. The crisis wasn't over. It had just changed shape. And as I stood there, watching Onyx keep his body between Ivy and everyone else, I realized I needed answers fast about her, about the dog, about why I was here in the first place and what I was risking for Eli. Because whatever this was, it wasn't random. So tell me what kind of life puts a child in front of a monster and makes her certain she'll be safe. My hands were still shaking, even though I was standing perfectly still. That's the weird thing about adrenaline. It doesn't care if the danger has shifted. It keeps running through you like you're still mid-impact. My throat felt tight. My ears kept searching for the growl that had vanished. And my eyes couldn't stop locking onto Ivy's small hand in that wall of black fur. Like if I looked away for even a second, reality would snap back to what it should be. I remember thinking, with a kind of dazed disbelief, how did I even end up here tonight? Because this wasn't supposed to be my life. I wasn't supposed to be standing in a Mafia courtyard at night, watching a guard dog rewrite everything I thought I understood about fear and control. I was supposed to be asleep on my couch, half dressed in scrubs, phone on my chest, ready to wake up if Eli coughed the wrong way. Eli is my whole world. He's the reason I know the sound of every machine at the clinic. He's the reason I can tell the difference between a tired cry and a scared one from across a room. He's the reason I've learned how to smile at a receptionist while my bank account looks like a joke. His care isn't a one-time thing. It's the kind of ongoing, grinding schedule that doesn't let you pretend life is normal. Therapy appointments, medication refills, follow-up visits, extra tests that always seem to get labeled recommended instead of covered. And it's not just the money, it's the constant fear that you'll miss something, that you'll fail him in some quiet way that doesn't show up on paperwork until it's too late. I've had nights where I sat on the bathroom floor, back against the tub, trying to breathe through the panic while the shower ran so he wouldn't hear me falling apart. I've learned to do calculations in my head while I'm making grilled cheese. How many hours can I pick up this week? Which bill can wait? Which one can't? How many times can you swipe a card before the decline feels personal? So when that job offer came in, it didn't feel like a thrill. It felt like a door cracking open in a hallway I'd been sprinting down with no exits. It showed up late, one of those calls that makes your stomach tighten before you even answer, because nobody calls with good news at that hour. The voice on the other end didn't give me a name, and I didn't offer mine like it mattered. It was all framed as discreet and private, with a payment that made my brain stall for a second. 5,000 yuan. I remember staring at the number on my screen like it was a typo. Like someone had accidentally put an extra zero in a world where people like me were lucky to get overtime approved. The conditions came fast right after. No paperwork, no hospital, no records, no questions. Overnight only. In and out. And the kind of insistence that told me exactly what kind of house I'd be walking into. Every warning bell in my head went off at once. And then Eli's face did that thing it always does in my mind when I'm deciding between safe and necessary. That soft, trusting expression kids have when they believe you can fix anything, even when you're barely holding it together. What would you do if your kid needed help, and the only door that opened was the wrong one? That's the part people don't like to admit out loud. Sometimes life doesn't offer good choices. Sometimes it offers choices that keep the lights on and choices that make you tell your child not yet. So many times that not yet starts to sound like never. I didn't take the job because I trusted it. I took it because I trusted myself to stay sharp. I told myself I could walk into anything, do the medical part, and walk out again without letting the rest touch me. Because I've been trained to function inside chaos. Before I became just a single mom juggling shifts, I worked the kind of nights where you learn to read a room in one breath. I've done ER overflow. I've done ambulance runs where you're kneeling in cramped spaces with sirens screaming outside and someone's life leaking away in front of you. I've had people spit at me, beg me, scream at me, apologize to me. I've learned to make decisions fast, with half the information, while everyone around me panics. When you've lived that long enough, you develop a calm that isn't peace, it's focus. It's your mind narrowing down to what matters and cutting everything else away. That's why, even in the courtyard, I didn't freeze completely. My body wanted to, my instincts wanted to run, but the training part of me kept cataloging details. Ivy's thin wrists, her posture, the way her breathing wasn't frantic, the way Onyx went from lethal to something else, like he'd been holding his breath for a year and she just handed him air. And that's what scared me most. Not the aggression. Aggression makes sense. The recognition didn't, because now I wasn't just in a shady house on a discreet job. Now I was standing inside a question I didn't know how to answer. A child had walked into a kill zone like she belonged there, and the most feared animal on the property had chosen her like she was his only instruction. I felt the moral knot tighten in my chest. The part of me that wanted to grab Ivy and run collided with the part of me that knew you can't just run off a crime lord's property with a child and a guard dog. And underneath that was the ugly truth I didn't want to face. I'd walked in here thinking I could keep my head down and stay invisible. But nothing about this was invisible anymore. Declan was close enough now that I could feel the gravity of him, even without looking straight at him. The way people moved around him told me he didn't just own the house, he owned the air in it. And yet his dog's body was angled away from him, shielding Ivy like Declan was the threat. That's when it hit me. This wasn't going to end with me checking a pulse and collecting cash. Whatever just happened changed the rules in a place built on rules, and I could feel it like a door had closed behind me without making a sound. I finally forced myself to look at Declan fully, and my stomach tightened again. Not with attraction exactly, but with a wary awareness I hated. He wasn't loud. He wasn't frantic. He was controlled danger in a tailored shape, and for the first time, I saw that control flicker at the edges. If he decided I was a problem, I wouldn't get a second chance. And if he decided Ivy mattered, then every boundary I thought I had was about to get tested. So I swallowed, steadied my hands, and made myself focus on what I always focus on when everything is spinning. Who needs help? What's the priority? And how do I keep a child alive in a world that doesn't care? Then I drew a careful breath, watching the fortress around us hold its silence, and I understood something with brutal clarity. Declan Kane was about to decide what I was in this place, nurse, liability, or something he could use. And whatever he decided, I was still a mother. Standing in his courtyard, the courtyard didn't relax after the whisper. It just rearranged its danger. Everything around us moved like a machine that had been built for one purpose: control. Floodlights stayed locked on the open stone like the place was meant to be watched. Cameras on the corners of the mansion tracked tiny shifts, the way a head turns when it thinks nobody sees. The iron gates stood tall and still, not decorative, functional, heavy. A message. Even the gravel along the path seemed designed to tattletale, to announce every footstep with that sharp crunch you can't hide. The guards didn't crowd Ivy the way normal people might rush a child in trouble. They kept a disciplined distance, spacing themselves out like they were forming a perimeter around a bomb. Radios sat near their collars, silent now. But I could see the habit in their hands, 2 fingers hovering like they were ready to call in an entire response team with one word. That was the first lesson of Declan Kane's fortress. Noise wasn't necessary. Signals were. And Declan himself, he didn't rush in with panic. He didn't fill the space with threats or promises. He simply arrived, and the energy adjusted around him like the compound recognized its owner. I finally took a full look at him. Not the quick, terrified scan from before, but the clinical kind of observation I do when I'm trying to understand what I'm up against. He held himself like someone who never had to prove he was dangerous because everyone already knew. Tailored coat, steady hands, face unreadable in the floodlights. He didn't waste movement. He didn't fidget. Even his stillness felt like a command. What struck me was the way his eyes stayed on the variables, not the spectacle. Not Ivy's smallness, not the shock of the dog dropping down. He watched Onyx's posture, the spacing of his men, the angles, like he was already building the next 10 seconds in his head. That level of control should have made me feel safer. Instead, it made me feel like I was standing too close to a blade that hadn't decided whether to cut. Because Onyx had changed, yes, but he hadn't become harmless. He had become assigned. His body stayed between Ivy and the rest of the world. Not just as a barrier, but as a warning. His eyes tracked micro-movements the way a trained fighter tracks shoulders and hips before a punch. One guard shifted his boot a fraction on the stone, and Onyx's head turned instantly, silent and precise. Not snarling, not barking, just watching in a way that said, "I saw that. Don't do it again." I felt that attention flick toward me too. A spotlight. What do you do when the most dangerous thing in the room suddenly decides you're the threat? My instincts were split right down the middle. The mother in me wanted to go straight to the child. The professional in me wanted to do an assessment from a safe distance first. The survivor in me, the woman who'd taken a job in a place with armed men and iron gates, wanted to stay exactly where I was and not become a story that ends badly. So I did what I always do when I'm scared. I worked. I looked at Ivy with the kind of careful scan that doesn't require touch. Tiny wrists, shoulders hunched like she'd been bracing against cold for too long. Her coat swallowed her frame, but it couldn't hide how thin she was. Her lips looked dry and cracked, the kind of chapping you see when someone's been outside in winter air without enough water. Her cheeks had that hollowed-out look of a kid who's missed too many meals, too many days in a row. And her eyes were what didn't fit. They weren't wide with normal child panic. They weren't darting around looking for an adult to save her. They were steady, tired, focused, like she'd learned early that fear doesn't help you survive, and calm is a kind of armor. I hated how familiar that felt. Onyx pressed closer to her. Not crushing, not rough. He moved like he knew exactly how fragile she was. His body offered warmth. His head dipped under her hand like he was asking permission to exist beside her. For a second, the whole thing looked almost gentle if you ignored the fact that his muscles still carried the promise of violence. I stole another glance at Declan, because I needed to know what kind of man I was about to step in front of. He wasn't softening. Not outwardly. But I could tell he was calculating in a different direction now. His dog had chosen Ivy. That wasn't just a cute moment, it was a breach in his system. And systems like this don't tolerate breaches unless the owner allows it. I could feel the silent question hovering over the courtyard. Who gets to decide what happens next? Declan's people waited for him. The cameras waited. Even the cold felt like it was waiting, creeping up from the stone into my shoes. And Ivy stood there, like the waiting didn't scare her. That's what finally snapped something into place inside me. Because a child that small shouldn't have to be that composed. A child that small shouldn't have to walk into the most dangerous part of a man's fortress to get safe. I took a slow breath. In my head, I ran a quick checklist the way I do in triage. Exposure, circulation, respiration, hydration, temperature, mental status. She was upright, which meant she had some strength left, but her posture told me she was running on fumes. The cold alone could push a kid like her over the edge fast, add hunger and exhaustion, and it becomes a countdown. I didn't have the luxury of waiting for permission that might never come, so I made the decision the way I've made 100 hard decisions before, quietly, firmly, and with the full understanding that it could cost me. I shifted my weight forward, careful and slow, making sure Onyx could see every inch of my movement. My hands stayed visible. My voice stayed inside my head, Because this wasn't a place where words helped. I angled my body slightly, the way you approach a frightened animal or a traumatized patient, non-threatening, respectful, ready to stop the second you're told no. I could feel Declan watching. Not like a man watching a nurse, like a man watching a variable. And I knew I was about to be tested. Not with threats, not with shouting, with a choice. Would he let me do what I came here to do, help someone who needed it when helping her was inconvenient, risky, and out of script? Because Ivy didn't just need a blanket and a snack. She needed a proper evaluation. She needed warmth now, and medical eyes that could catch what mine could only suspect from a distance. As I took that careful step, I found myself thinking of one name I'd heard in whispers around this world, someone who could be called to a place like this without cops, without questions, without delay. Dr. Harper Dupont. And in that moment, I understood the night was turning from violence to triage. The next minutes would decide whether Ivy survived more than this courtyard, and whether Declan Kane's fortress could bend for a child without breaking its own rules. I moved the way you move around a scared animal and a scared child at the same time. Slow enough to be understood, small enough not to trigger anything, and steady enough that my own fear didn't leak into my hands. Onyx watched every inch of me, not with the sloppy suspicion of an untrained dog, but with the clean focus of something built to make decisions fast. His body stayed angled toward Ivy, his shoulder blocking her like a shield. Even his breathing felt measured, like he was holding himself in place on purpose. So I did what I'd done in cramped apartments with traumatized patients, what I'd done in ambulances when someone was seconds from panic. I made my intentions obvious without forcing contact. Palms open, no sudden reach, my weight balanced so I could stop instantly. I started my assessment from the outside in. Ivy's skin had that pale, chilled look you see when a body has been losing warmth faster than it can make it. Her coat was too big, but it wasn't enough. Her lips were split from cold and dehydration. Her eyes stayed steady, but her blinking was slow, like exhaustion was pulling her under in tiny waves. And when the wind cut through the courtyard, her shoulders trembled in a way she tried to hide, like she'd learned trembling makes adults act weird. There are certain signs you don't need a thermometer for. The faint flush in her cheeks that didn't match the cold, the glassy shine in her gaze, the way her breathing was a little too shallow, like every inhale cost something. Fever, dehydration, malnutrition, pure depletion, and underneath all of it, a kind of stubborn will that had kept her upright longer than her body wanted to. My chest tightened in that familiar mixture of professionalism and heartbreak. This was a child who didn't just end up hungry. This was a child who'd been missed, overlooked, left to solve survival with no tools. It lit something hot inside me, anger at the world, at systems, at every adult who walked past and decided it wasn't their problem. If you were me, would you step forward anyway? When stepping forward could make you a target, I forced my focus back to what mattered. Ivy didn't need my anger. She needed warmth, fluids, and an evaluation before her body crashed. The problem was, I wasn't the only gatekeeper here. Onyx was. Every time I shifted my weight, his eyes tracked it. When I lowered myself slightly to be closer to Ivy's level, he didn't growl, but his muscles tightened in a quiet warning. It was like the dog was saying, "You can help, but you don't get to decide the pace." So I changed my approach. I let Ivy lead without asking her to lead. I watched where her hand rested in Onyx's fur. I noticed that whenever she felt uncertain, even for a flicker, her fingers pressed down like she was checking for a heartbeat outside her own chest. She wasn't just petting him. She was anchoring herself. I took a breath and held it for a second, listening. The compound around us stayed eerily controlled. The floodlights didn't change. The guards didn't break formation. The cameras kept watching like unblinking eyes. Declan stood a few steps back, and even without hearing his voice, I felt his preference in the air. He wanted discretion. He wanted this handled inside his walls, by his rules, with no outside ripples. But a child's body doesn't care about a man's rules. That was when I saw movement at the edge of the courtyard, headlights sweeping over the stone, tires crunching gravel with quiet confidence, not hesitation. Whoever was arriving had clearance. The gate didn't make a dramatic show of opening. It simply allowed. A woman crossed the lawn fast, but not frantic. Practical clothes, hair pulled back, posture of someone who's walked into emergencies before and doesn't waste time performing concern. Dr. Harper Dupont. I'd heard of her the way you hear of certain professionals in a city through sideways mentions, through the tone people use when they talk about someone who can't be bought. She wasn't just a vet. She was trained in human medical care too, and she carried herself like ethics were muscle memory. She took in the scene in one sweep. Ivy's condition, my stance, the guard's spacing, Declan's stillness. And then her eyes landed on Onyx, submissive, protective, pressed close to a child like he belonged to her. The surprise that crossed Harper's face was real and brief, and then it was replaced by something harder. Focus. She didn't treat Ivy like an inconvenience. She treated her like a patient. Harper approached in the same language I'd been using. Slow, visible, respectful. And Ivy's response was immediate in the smallest way. Her shoulders eased a fraction. Her gaze lifted, not fully trusting but allowing. It struck me that Ivy had spent too long reading Adults for Danger, and Harper's calm had a shape to it, clean, consistent, non-predatory. Ivy didn't soften for Declan. She softened for the person who looked like help without strings. Harper lowered herself to Ivy's level without reaching first, and Ivy's eyes flicked down to Onyx like she was checking with him. Onyx didn't move away. He didn't tense. He simply watched Harper with that same intense attention, and then just barely settled. Permission. Harper began assessing with the smallest, least invasive checks. Watching Ivy's breathing, noting the dehydration, measuring the heat coming off her skin with the back of her hand held near, not on, like she was negotiating consent in increments. Ivy didn't speak much. A nod. A blink. A tiny movement of her fingers in Onyx's fur that seemed to say more than words. And then the ethical tension surfaced, clean as a cut line. Declan's world operates on control and containment. Harper's world operates on care, even when care is inconvenient. I could feel Harper's insistence in the way she oriented her body between Ivy and the easy, dangerous option of doing the bare minimum and calling it handled. She wasn't here to patch Ivy up and disappear. She was here to keep a child alive. The practical dilemma slammed into all of us at once. Hospital or private care. Hospital meant protocols, records, questions, paper trails, authorities, child protective services. Ivy would be separated from the only thing she clearly trusted, Onyx. And after what I'd just witnessed, that separation felt like ripping out a life support line. Private care meant secrecy, yes, but it also meant responsibility. Equipment brought into the compound, people who had to be paid and kept quiet. Time, monitoring. It meant Declan Kane admitting he couldn't solve this alone with power and money in one clean transaction. I felt my stomach twist as I imagined Eli in a hospital bed, and someone telling me I wasn't allowed to touch him because paperwork hadn't caught up yet. It made my empathy sharpen into something fierce. Ivy didn't need a system right now. She needed stability. But she also needed real medicine. I watched Declan's expression stay composed while the decision churned behind his eyes. He was weighing risk the way men like him always do. Exposure versus control, liability versus outcome. And I hated that part of me understood why. In his world, the wrong ripple brings the wrong people to your door. Harper didn't bend. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, immovable way. The kind that makes even powerful men realize intimidation won't work. And then Declan chose. Not with a speech. With motion. A subtle signal. And his people moved like a practiced system. Radios lifted, doors opened, the path to the mansion cleared. Someone peeled off toward the house with the purposeful speed of setting up a room. Another headed to make calls. The fortress pivoted from defense to triage. Onyx stood first, positioning himself tight to Ivy's side like a brace. Ivy's hand gripped his fur, and she rose with a wobble that told me she was seconds away from collapsing if she pushed too hard. Onyx adjusted immediately, offering his body like a living crutch. I stepped in close enough to catch her if needed, careful not to touch unless she fell into me. The mother in me wanted to scoop her up. The professional in me knew better. Traumatized kids don't always tolerate being grabbed, even when it's meant kindly. And Onyx would decide whether my touch was a threat. We moved inside. Warmth hit us the second the doors closed, and Ivy's eyelids fluttered like her body finally realized it was allowed to stop fighting the cold. The mansion smelled like clean wood and expensive soap comfort that felt almost obscene next to the way Ivy looked. A guest suite upstairs was being stripped and converted on the fly. Lights softened, linens pulled back, medical supplies appearing like magic. Because in Declan's world, urgent makes resources materialize. Harper stayed close, anchoring Ivy with her presence. Not because Ivy clung to her, but because Ivy tolerated her. And in this situation, tolerance was trust. Declan hovered at the edge of the room like a man used to owning every space, now forced to share it with a child and a dog that wouldn't take his commands the way they used to. When Ivy finally sagged, her legs giving out in a slow surrender, Declan moved fast, catching her with a gentleness that didn't match his reputation. It wasn't softness. It was control redirected. Harper immediately took over the care plan, setting expectations through action. Monitoring, fluids, gradual feeding, observation through the night. And without fanfare, she made another decision too. She wasn't leaving Ivy alone in this fortress of strangers. She was staying. A fragile relief settled over me, the kind that comes when a crisis finally has a direction. But it didn't erase the unease, because the biggest question was still sitting in the room with us, silent and steady. How did Ivy get here? And why did Onyx recognize her like she was the only rule that mattered? As the staff finished setting up the suite, my eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the security screens I knew had to exist somewhere in this place. A compound like this doesn't miss anything. Not footsteps, not shadows, not a child slipping through a gap. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Ivy didn't wander in. She came here on purpose. So the next thing I needed, maybe the only thing that could make this make sense, was the footage, the timeline, the proof of how a little girl walked straight into a monster's territory and turned him into her guardian with one word I never even heard. Because if this was intentional, what else was coming? The guest suite upstairs had turned into a quiet little war zone. Clean sheets, IV supplies, warm blankets, Harper moving with calm purpose while Onyx hovered like a black shadow that refused to blink. I should have stayed there. A normal person would have. But my brain wouldn't let go of the same question that kept pulsing under my ribs like a second heartbeat. How? How did a child that small get through an 18-acre fortress built to keep grown men out? So when I saw one of Declan's men motion toward the corridor that led deeper into the house, past locked doors and silent cameras, I followed. Not because I belonged there, because the only way I knew how to survive was to understand the situation I was standing in. The security hub felt like the opposite of the courtyard. The courtyard was open air and floodlights and raw tension. The hub was dim, sealed, humming, screens stacked on walls like a command center, tiny red time codes blinking in the corners, feeds from gates, driveways, rooflines, and thermal overlays that turned bodies into heat shapes. A place like this doesn't trust memory. It trusts footage. Declan stood behind the main console, not hunched, not frantic, just locked in. The men around him moved quietly, almost reverently, like they knew better than to interrupt his concentration. I watched his face in the glow of the monitors and realized something that made my stomach tighten. In the courtyard, his power had been challenged by a dog's choice. In this room, his power was absolute. His mind shifted into a mode that felt predatory, but not sloppy, not emotional. More like a chess player deciding which pieces mattered and which ones didn't. He wasn't searching for comfort, he was searching for cause. And I was searching for something else. I was searching for proof that Ivy didn't just wander in like a lost kitten. The timeline started with a perimeter alert, some sensor on the outer edge registering movement. On the thermal feed, it looked almost ridiculous at first. A small, warm shape against cold ground. Too small to be a man, too steady to be a raccoon. For a few seconds, the guards on the feed treated it like nothing. You could tell by their posture, lazy attention, the kind people give to background noise. Then the shape stepped into a brighter patch of light, and my throat tightened. Even through grainy resolution and distance, I recognized the oversized coat, the too big sleeves, the uneven stride from mismatched shoes. A child, a real child. My brain tried to reject it, the way it rejects things that don't belong in certain spaces. Kids don't walk toward crime lord fortresses. Kids don't trigger thermal sensors. Kids don't exist in the same sentence as Eastern Courtyard after dark. Tells now, but there she was. The footage tracked her from a distance, bouncing between angles as she moved along the perimeter line. Not running, not stumbling, just walking with that same eerie steadiness I'd seen in person. She passed one entrance without even turning her head. She didn't pause at a well-lit gate that looked easier. She didn't drift toward the main driveway, where a desperate person might hope to be seen. She moved like she already knew the answer to the question, where do I go? How does a kid move like that? Like she's counting steps in her head, like she's following an invisible string? The camera switched to a view of the delivery side, less polished, more utilitarian. And there, Ivy stopped, not in panic, in study. She stood still for long seconds, head tilting slightly, eyes scanning. I could almost feel her thinking through the screen. She stepped closer, tested the metal, then moved along it like she was searching for a specific flaw. Her hands looked so small against the gate, but the motions were methodical. Pat, press, wiggle. Then she found it. A gap barely enough for a child's shoulder. The kind of defect that makes grown men shrug and say they'll fix it later, because what could possibly fit through there? Ivy fit. She turned sideways and slipped in with the practiced ease of someone who'd squeezed into tight places before. Not clumsy, not forced, just familiar. That detail hit me harder than the breach itself, because it wasn't just that she found the weak point, it was that her body knew what to do with it. Who teaches a child to look for the deadliest place first, and how to get inside it? The feed jumped again, another camera catching her crossing open ground. Frosted lawn, floodlights, shadows stretched thin. She didn't run even when she was exposed. She didn't crouch like she was afraid of being seen. She simply walked, coat flapping around her legs, heading straight toward the mansion's eastern side. And then came the moment that made my skin prickle. She stopped, right there in the open. She lifted her face toward the building, not the main entrance, not the bright windows, but the eastern wing, the darker stretch where the courtyard sat behind iron gates like a mouth. She stared for a few seconds, then made a tiny movement with her head, a nod. Almost like she was confirming something she'd already known, like checking an internal compass. Then she changed direction. She turned away from safer routes and headed directly for the one place every adult in that compound avoided, the eastern courtyard. The footage didn't capture her expression perfectly, but the body language was unmistakable. Purpose, commitment, no hesitation, no confusion. I felt my chest go tight again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was awe, laced with something that hurt. Because adults like to believe kids are protected by the world, that they wander because they're naive, that they get lost because they don't know better. Ivy didn't look naive on those screens. She looked like someone who had been given a mission and decided failure wasn't an option. Declan watched the same footage, and I could almost see the different conclusions forming behind his eyes. For him, it was a security breach, an unknown variable, a threat in the shape of a child, something that shouldn't have happened, which meant someone had made it happen, or someone had missed something. For me, it looked like a promise. A kid keeping herself together long enough to get to the one place she believed would matter. I thought about Harper upstairs, about the careful way she'd read Ivy like a patient, and the way Ivy's fingers kept returning to Onyx like a lifeline. I thought about Onyx in the courtyard, not just submitting, relieving, like a tension finally released, and a new suspicion settled in my bones. The whisper hadn't been magic. It had been recognition. I couldn't prove that yet, not from grainy footage and time codes, but the pattern was too clean, too targeted. She hadn't come for the mansion. She hadn't come for food or warmth or mercy. She had come for the dog. As the footage ended, the room felt quieter somehow, like everyone was holding the same breath for different reasons. Declan's men waited for his next move. Declan waited for the next piece of data that would put this back under control. And I waited for something I didn't know how to ask for without sounding crazy. Because if Ivy knew exactly where Onyx would be, then she knew something about Onyx that the rest of us didn't. There had to be history. There had to be a past name, a file, a purchase record, some paper trail that existed before Declan's fortress, and before the courtyard rule ever became legend. And I had the sinking feeling that the answers weren't going to be simple. If you were me, would you want to know the truth? Even if the truth makes everything more dangerous? I glanced toward the hallway that led back upstairs, toward the room where Ivy lay fighting fever and cold and exhaustion. Then I looked back at the screens, at the time codes, at the way the system had captured every step of her path like evidence. The next step wasn't more footage. It was paperwork. Because somewhere in Declan Kane's world, there would be a document with Onyx's original history on it, a registered name, a previous placement, a gap that didn't make sense. And I could feel it coming. The moment when someone would open a file and the whole story would tilt on its axis. I thought I was done being surprised for the night. After the courtyard, after the footage, after watching a dog built like a weapon fold himself to the ground like he'd been waiting for that little girl all along. But the real collapse didn't happen under floodlights. It happened under the soft glow of a desk lamp, in a room full of screens, when Harper came back downstairs with a tablet pressed to her chest like it weighed more than it should. She didn't come in loud. She didn't need to. The way she moved told me she'd found something that didn't fit. Her eyes flicked to Declan first because this was his house, his dog, his rules, and then to me, like she was checking if I was still the same person who'd walked into the courtyard an hour ago. I don't think I was. Harper had pulled Onyx's file from wherever Declan kept the boring details of his life. Purchase paperwork, medical records, transfer agreements. The kind of stuff men like him pretend doesn't matter until it does. And one line, just one, was wrong. The name on the file wasn't Onyx. It wasn't anything Declan's people called him. It was longer, older, official in the way paperwork tries to be final. Umbra del passato. Harper didn't need to dramatize it. The name did the work all by itself. I knew enough to piece it together even before she explained umbra, shadow, passato, past. Shadow of the past. I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with winter. Because when you spend your whole life paying bills and chasing normalcy, you start to believe names are just labels. In Declan Kane's world, names were usually masks. But this one didn't feel like a mask. It felt like a warning. Declan leaned closer, eyes scanning the document like he could force it to change by staring hard enough. He didn't look angry. Not yet. He looked recalibrated, like the part of him that ran a private city inside a fence was adjusting to a new variable he hadn't planned for. Harper's finger moved to another spot on the record. A gap in the timeline. Not a day. Not a week. Months. A stretch of time where the dog existed on paper, but didn't exist anywhere specific. No handler. No facility. No clean chain of custody. In a world where everything is controlled, a gap like that isn't an accident. Harper had already chased it down. I could tell. That's what people like her do when something feels off. They follow it until it stops running. The missing months led to a place I'd never heard of. A small, off-the-books animal sanctuary. The kind that took in dogs nobody else wanted. Fighting ring survivors. Abuse cases. Animals with broken trust and sharp teeth. The ones shelters label too dangerous because it's easier than admitting we don't have the patience to heal them. That part hit me hard because I'd seen the human version of it in my ER days. People written off as problems because the story behind them was messy. Harper didn't say it like a fairy tale. She said it like a fact pattern, careful and clean. The sanctuary existed. It wasn't legal. It wasn't fancy. But it was real. And then it burned. Not recently. Not last week. Long enough ago that the city had moved on and the internet had stopped caring. The couple who ran it died in the fire. And their daughter. I felt my breath hitch before Harper even finished, because my brain had already connected the line to the face upstairs. The daughter was officially listed as deceased. No recovered body, no confirmed remains. Just paperwork that had decided the conclusion and filed it away. Ivy was declared dead. The room did something strange after that. It didn't get louder. It didn't explode. It went small, like the air tightened around us, like the walls leaned in to listen. I've worked around grief and shock long enough to know that silence is never empty. Silence is where the truth lands. I thought about the footage we'd just watched, her steady walk, her methodical hands, her pause toward the eastern wing like she was checking a compass. And suddenly it didn't feel like a security breach at all. It felt like a child walking through the world with a hole in her chest, chasing the only thread she had left. How does a child survive being erased? Not just by fire, by paperwork, by a system that can shrug and stamp a form and move on. Declan's face stayed controlled, but something in his eyes shifted. His attention stopped being about the compound and started being about the story behind it. That didn't soften him. It made him sharper. Like he could sense that what happened tonight wasn't random, it was unfinished business. Harper didn't look triumphant. She looked devastated in that quiet, professional way, like she was trying not to let emotion blur the facts. But the facts themselves were cruel. Then she pulled up the proof that made my throat tighten. An archived photo. Not high quality. Not polished. Just an old image from a forgotten post-sunlight. Concrete floors. Chain link in the background like a makeshift kennel area. A younger Cane Corso, thinner than onyx, but unmistakable in the shape of his head and the intensity of his eyes, was pressed against a little girl's side. The girl was Ivy. Only, she wasn't the Ivy I'd seen in the courtyard. This Ivy had cheeks that looked full, hair brushed, a grin that didn't have fear hiding behind it. Her arms were wrapped around that younger dog like he was her whole world, and she wasn't embarrassed about it. And the dog Umbra didn't look like a weapon in that picture. He looked like a survivor learning to breathe again. The contrast hit like a punch. Upstairs, Ivy was small enough that my nurse brain kept counting risks the way it always does. Cold exposure, dehydration, exhaustion. But in that photo, she was just a kid. A kid with a dog and a life that made sense. I stared at the screen, then shut my eyes for a second because I could suddenly see the invisible line connecting everything. The courtyard wasn't magic. That whisper wasn't a spell. It was Ivy reaching back into the dog's past and touching the part of him that existed before training, before teeth and territory, before Declan's fortress ever claimed him. She hadn't called him what Declan called him. She'd called him what he was when he belonged to her world. And the dog had answered like memory was stronger than conditioning, like love was stronger than commands. My chest tightened in a way that felt almost angry. Not at Ivy, not at Harper, at the world. Because what kind of life forces a child to become a ghost and still keep walking? What kind of night takes a girl declared dead and drops her into the one place everyone swears you can't survive? I looked toward the hallway leading upstairs, toward the room where she lay under warm blankets with a fever that was finally starting to ease. Onyx curled nearby like a living wall. And a new fear replaced the old one. The danger wasn't Onyx anymore. The danger was the truth. Because at some point, Ivy would wake up stronger. She would look around, realize she was safe, and start asking the questions kids always ask when the world finally slows down enough to feel. Where are my parents? What happened? Why am I here? And the hardest question of all, what does she believe? Does she think her parents are waiting somewhere? Does she think the fire was an accident she outran? Or has she been living with the knowledge for months, holding herself together with one single mission? Find the dog, keep the promise, survive long enough to do it? How do you tell a kid the world already buried her once? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. All I knew was that Ivy's body might be healing upstairs, but her heart was still running on whatever promise had carried her here. And when that promise finally broke open, it was going to break all of us with it. When I went back upstairs, the mansion had gone quiet in that strange way. Expensive places do at night. Too much space, not enough human sound. The guest suite door was half closed, light leaking out in a warm strip across the hall like someone had drawn a line and dared the darkness to cross it. Inside, everything had been rearranged into a kind of makeshift shelter. Not a hospital, not really. More like a compromise between what Ivy needed and what Declan's world would allow. The monitors glowed soft and steady. The heater hummed. Harper had the room running on calm. And Onyx Umbra, the name that still didn't sit right in my mouth, was stationed at the bedside like a living lock. He didn't sleep the way dogs usually do. He rested with one eye half open, tracking movement. His body was turned so that if anyone reached for Ivy too fast, they'd meet him first. The same dog who'd turned men into shaking statues in that courtyard was now keeping vigil like a guardian that had finally found his purpose. Ivy stirred as I stepped in. Not the dramatic kind of wake-up you see in movies. Just the tiniest shift, a faint wrinkle of her brow. A shallow breath that turned into a cough she tried to swallow back. Her eyelashes fluttered, and then her eyes opened, unfocused at first, searching the room like she was trying to decide if she'd landed in a dream or a trap. The first thing she looked for wasn't me. It wasn't Harper. It wasn't Declan. Even though I could feel his presence before I saw him standing back near the door, quiet and controlled, like he didn't want his size and power to overwhelm the room. No. Ivy's gaze went straight to the dog. Her fingers moved before the rest of her body did, reaching out like instinct. Onyx leaned in immediately, closing the distance so she wouldn't have to, his head lowered to her hand as if he understood she needed proof. She pressed her palm into his fur, and I watched her shoulders drop a fraction, the way a child settles when the only safe thing in their world is still there. That's when it hit me, clear as a needle. Survival had taught her to orient to comfort first, not people, and I wondered what happens to a child when survival is the only language she's allowed to speak. Harper moved with the kind of patience you can't fake. She checked Ivy's forehead, adjusted the blanket, monitored her breathing. No rushing, no crowding. She made herself smaller in the room so Ivy could feel bigger. I stayed near the foot of the bed, hands loose at my sides, letting my nurse instincts do what they always do. Assess, anticipate, don't scare the patient. But there was another part of me, louder and roar, that wasn't a nurse at all. It was a mother watching a child whose body had been carrying a load it was never meant to carry. Ivy tried to speak. It came out in broken pieces, fragments of thought and breath, the way words do when you're exhausted and you've been holding them in for too long. She didn't explain like an adult. She didn't build a story. She reached for one idea and clung to it. A promise. I didn't need her to say it clean. I could see it in the way her face tightened, in the way her grip on Onyx's fur became urgent. She'd been running on one command, one instruction that kept her feet moving even when her body wanted to quit. She'd promised her mother she would find him. Not for comfort, not for shelter, to make sure he was safe. That realization landed so hard I felt it in my teeth. A child didn't walk into a Mafia fortress because she was reckless. She walked in because she was loyal, because that loyalty was the last thing connecting her to the life she'd lost. How do you keep a promise when the world already decided you're gone? I watched Ivy's eyes drift toward Harper, then flick back to the dog again, like she was triangulating who was safe. Harper's calm seemed to help her, but Onyx was still the center of her gravity. Every time she lost focus, her fingers found his fur again. Every time her breathing hitched, he shifted closer, warm and steady, pressing his body along the side of the bed like a heated wall. And then something in Ivy finally gave way. It wasn't loud at first, just a tremble. A thin sound caught in her throat like she didn't remember how to cry without consequences. Like crying used to mean you'd be heard, and being heard used to mean you'd be hurt. But she was warm now. She was fed enough to stop fighting for every calorie. She had a roof. She had a doctor who didn't bark orders. She had a dog who remembered her. And once those things were real, the mission that had held her upright didn't need to do that job anymore. So grief did what grief always does when it finally gets permission. It flooded. Ivy's face crumpled and she shook with the kind of crying that comes from months of holding your breath. She tried to keep it quiet, and that made it worse. Small sobs turning into coughing, coughing turning into exhausted whimpers. Harper guided her through it with slow hands and softer movements, keeping her upright, helping her sip water, reminding her body it was allowed to stay in one place. I didn't step in to fix it. There's no fixing that. I just stood there, throat tight, eyes burning, feeling helpless in a way my training never prepared me for. In the ER, you could hang fluids, push meds, stabilize vitals. Here, the injury was invisible, and the only treatment was safety and time. Onyx pressed even closer, whining once under his breath, then going still again, letting Ivy bury her fingers into him like he was a lifeline. His earlier violence was gone. Not hidden. Gone. Like that part of him belonged to a different life. Declan didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to take control. He just watched. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something I didn't expect. A man with too much power standing in front of a pain he couldn't buy, threaten, or outmaneuver. His face stayed unreadable, but his stillness wasn't cold. It was restraint. Like he knew this moment wasn't his to touch. Like he understood that any heavy footstep, any sharp command, would shatter whatever fragile safety had formed around that bed. His fortress, the iron gates, the cameras, the rules felt suddenly pointless. All that fear-built architecture, and the most intimate thing happening inside it was a child finally feeling safe enough to fall apart. My anger rose in a slow burn, not at any person in that room, but at everything outside it. A child had been declared dead. Declared. Like a stamp could close the book on a life. Like paperwork could replace a search. Like the world could shrug and let a 7-year-old become a ghost because it was simpler than admitting it failed her. I didn't rant. I didn't have the energy for that kind of performance. I just felt it heavy and hot in my chest, and I knew I'd carry it for a long time. After a while, Ivy's crying slowed. Not because it was finished, but because her body ran out of fuel. Harper adjusted the blankets again. Onyx stayed pressed to her side. Ivy's fingers loosened but didn't let go. And something inside me shifted with a quiet finality. Because as I watched her drift back into sleep, I didn't just see Ivy. I saw Eli. I saw my own son on nights when his pain made him small, when he needed me to be the steady thing in the room. I thought about his therapy schedule, his medication refills, the way his voice sounds when he tries to act brave for me. And I realized, with a sharp inhale, that I hadn't checked my phone in too long. The job I'd taken for money had turned into something else entirely, something I couldn't unsee. Something I couldn't walk away from without feeling like I'd betrayed my own kid by turning my back on someone else's. I stepped into the hallway for a breath, hand pressed to my chest like I could slow my heartbeat that way. And all I could think was this. I came here to earn $5,000 and go home, but Ivy had walked into this fortress and dragged my heart in with her. Now I had to figure out what that meant for her, for Eli, and for the man standing silently at the doorway like he was waiting to see what kind of person I'd choose to be next. I didn't go back into Ivy's room right away. I stood in the hallway with my palm pressed to the wall like I could borrow steadiness from it. My chest still felt tight from hearing her finally break, like grief had been trapped under her ribs for months, and the second she felt safe, it came rushing out. I'd seen people cry in hospital rooms before. I'd seen panic, anger, denial, but a child crying because she kept a promise and now she doesn't know what to do with herself? That hit different. It hit right where Eli lives in me. Because the moment Ivy's fingers dug into Onyx's fur, the moment I understood she'd been walking on one thin thread of purpose, my mind went straight to my son. Not as a sentimental thought, as a physical pull, like my body was trying to leave the compound and teleport to him. Motherhood doesn't let you watch another child suffer without doing math you never asked for. If that were Eli, who would stay? Who would fight for him if I wasn't there? That's when real life crashed into the fortress. I finally pulled my phone out of my pocket, and the bright screen made my eyes sting. A missed call notification sat there like a bruise. Another message icon, a reminder from earlier that I'd swiped away without thinking. My heart kicked hard. I didn't have a long conversation. I couldn't, and I wasn't about to stand in a Mafia hallway spilling my private life into the air. But I sent something simple, something that carried more emotion than words should be able to hold. I told myself the person watching Eli would read it and understand my tone. I'm okay. I'm working. Please check on him. Please don't let him wake up scared. Then I stared at the screen a second too long, imagining his small face in the dark, wondering where I was. Guilt is a strange thing. It shows up even when you're doing what you have to do. I took this job for him. I took this job because $5,000 could buy medicine and therapy and breathing room. I told myself I could handle one night of discomfort if it meant another month of stability. But standing here, knowing Ivy had been declared dead and still had to survive alone, my justification started to feel thin. Eli had a bed, a home, me. Ivy had a promise and a dog that remembered her. And that comparison did something ugly inside me. It made my gratitude hurt. It made me angry at the world in a way that didn't feel noble. It felt personal. How many kids fall through cracks because nobody powerful is watching? I leaned my head back against the wall and forced a slow breath. My nurse brain tried to regain control. You can't carry every child you meet. You can't fix the system in one night. You can't lose your own kid trying to save someone else's. And then the other voice, quieter, stubborn, truer, answered back. You can't walk away from this one. Not now. Would you walk away if it wasn't your child? I was asking myself that like a challenge, like a test I already knew I'd fail. Because the truth was, Ivy wasn't my child. But she had become a mirror. I saw my own survival choices in her, just scaled down and made crueler. I'd taken a shady job because the world doesn't leave single moms many clean doors. Ivy had walked into a monster's courtyard because the world had literally written her off. We were both moving through danger because necessity had shoved us there. And that's when I felt him before I saw him. Declan. Not in a romantic way. In the way you feel a storm shift the air pressure. He wasn't noisy. He didn't announce himself. He didn't have to. People like him take up space without asking. I looked down the hallway and he was there. A few yards away. Posture relaxed in a way that wasn't actually relaxed, more like controlled stillness. His attention wasn't on his phone. It wasn't on the guards. It was on the door to Ivy's room, the soft strip of light beneath it, the shape of Onyx's shadow when the dog moved. He was watching the same thing I'd been watching, but I could tell our minds were doing different work. My mind kept circling the child. His mind was already rebuilding the entire night into a problem he could solve. That should have annoyed me. It should have made me resent him the fact that he could turn tragedy into strategy and keep his face calm. Instead, something uncomfortable happened. I felt safer with him in the hall. Not safe in a sweet way. Safe in a, there are walls and rules and people who will move if he moves kind of way. The kind of safety that comes from power, not kindness. And I hated that my body recognized it. I hated that a small part of me noticed the restraint in him too. The fact that he hadn't barged into Ivy's grief, hadn't tried to control it. He'd stayed at the edge like he understood that his presence could crush something fragile. There was loneliness in that kind of restraint. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind that grows in people who are always obeyed and rarely trusted. I caught myself noticing it, and my stomach tightened with irritation at him, at me, at the whole situation. This was not the place to feel anything complicated, but I did. Because I'm human, because I'm tired, because the night had cracked open something in me. Declan didn't speak, at least not in any way I could repeat. But he didn't need to. I watched the way he shifted his weight, the way his eyes flicked to a guard at the far end of the hall, the way the guard immediately stepped away and moved with purpose. A door down the corridor opened. Lights came on in a room I hadn't noticed before. A staff member carried fresh linens in. Someone else appeared with a tray water, coffee, a small first aid kit like they were preparing for a longer stay. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't being offered as hospitality. It was being arranged as expectation. Declan Kane was setting my place in his house like a piece on a board. Not because he cared about my comfort, because Ivy had responded to the calm I brought, and Harper trusted my hands, and Onyx didn't see me as an enemy as long as I moved carefully. I was useful, and usefulness in a fortress like this comes with a price. You don't leave when you feel like it. My first instinct was to resist, to remind myself I was here for one night, one payment, one job, to take my bag and go back to my real life where the rules are normal and the threats are bills, not guns. Then I pictured Ivy's face right before she cried the moment her mission finally loosened and she looked like a kid who didn't know what to do with safety. and my second instinct drowned the first. Leaving now would feel like abandoning her, like becoming another adult who sees her pain and steps around it. So I stood there, phone still warm in my hand from texting about Eli, and I realized I was considering staying longer in a place that terrified me, because the idea of walking out felt worse. That's how fast a line gets crossed when you're a mother. You think you have rules until you meet a child who needs one. Declan's attention shifted away from me for a second, toward the stairs, toward the lower level where the security hub sat. I caught the faint movement of staff in the distance, quiet footsteps, purposeful, the kind you see when something new has been discovered. His investigation mode was waking up, and I felt it like a change in temperature. Whatever we'd found in those records tonight, the sanctuary, the fire, the fact that Ivy had been declared dead, was not going to stay in the category of sad story. Declan didn't treat mysteries like tragedy. He treated them like unfinished business. I looked back at Ivy's door, then down the hall toward the stairwell, and something in my gut whispered that the fire story had sharper edges than we were ready to touch. Because accidents don't usually leave children alive and declared dead at the same time. And the way Declan's people were moving now, too precise, too quiet, felt like the beginning of a hunt. Something shifted in the house after Ivy fell asleep. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But I could feel it the way you feel a hospital change when a trauma code gets called. People moving with purpose, voices dropping, doors opening that usually stay closed. The fortress was doing what it was designed to do, tightening. Downstairs, the security room was alive again. Screens glowed. Time codes ran. A few of Declan's men stood in the same silent formation, but their attention was sharper now, like they weren't just guarding a property anymore. They were guarding a truth. Declan didn't look at me when I stepped in, but I could tell he knew I was there. He carried awareness like an extra sense. His focus stayed on the documents being pulled up, reports, purchase records, old news mentions, and the kind of official paperwork people assume is reliable just because it has a seal. The first thing that landed was the original fire investigation. It wasn't that it had wild, glaring errors. It was worse than that. It looked convenient. A quick conclusion. A clean narrative. A short timeline that wrapped up neatly. The kind of report that says, in polite professional language, this is tragic, but it's also done now. Next case. I've read enough incident summaries in my life to recognize when something was written to close a file instead of open questions, and as Declan's eyes moved over it, the weak spots started showing up like hairline cracks. There were inconsistencies in the timeline. A note about an electrical issue that didn't match the type of damage described. A section where a key photo attachment was referenced but not actually included. A witness statement summarized in 2 lines that felt too tidy, like someone had sanded down anything that might complicate the ending. I watched Declan absorb it all without changing expression. But the air around him hardened. He was done treating this like a sad story that ended with fire and bad luck. Then came the details that made my stomach drop. Not gore, not horror movie stuff, just facts that should have triggered deeper digging and somehow didn't. An electrical panel irregularity that didn't line up with the building's layout. A mention of unusual residue that was never followed up with a lab note. A gap in documentation around who secured the site first, and what was touched before investigators arrived. The kind of stuff a rushed investigation shrugs at. The kind of stuff a deliberate fire depends on. My throat went tight as the idea took shape. Slow and undeniable. This may not have been an accident that stole Ivy's parents. This may have been a decision. And once that thought exists, it changes everything. What do you do when a tragedy starts looking like a business decision? Because the motive line showed up almost immediately after. Not in a villain speech. In paperwork. The sanctuary sat on valuable land that had become more valuable year after year as the area developed. There had been buyout attempts, not rumors. Documented pressure. Offers that got bigger, then sharper, then more aggressive when the owners refused. Harper's face flashed in my mind, her refusal to bend when Ivy needed care. The same type of stubborn integrity that makes you unpopular in systems built on convenience. I pictured Ivy's parents, the kind of people who would take in broken animals and keep going even when the world called them foolish. Of course they refused. And then, after the fire, the property didn't sit untouched in respectful mourning, the way people pretend it does in movies. It moved, fast. Within a surprisingly short span, the land was purchased by a development shell, one of those companies with a clean name that leads to a mailbox and a lawyer. A company with just enough distance to look legitimate, until you notice who keeps showing up in the background of their other deals. Someone connected to one of Declan's rivals. Not named outright. Not fully drawn in yet. just a shadowy connection that made the hair on my arms lift. The kind of connection that explains why a case got wrapped up quickly, why a missing child could be declared dead without a body, why the world would rather accept a neat ending than dig into a messy one. My anger rose again, hot and sickening. Not the kind of anger that makes you rant, the kind that makes you see how easily people like Ivy get erased when it's useful. I thought of that line from the file declared dead, and it felt even crueler now. Declared dead wasn't just an assumption. It was a closing move, a way to remove the last loose thread, a way to make the story safe for the people who benefited. Harper came down briefly, moving quietly, her expression careful like she didn't want to bring the weight of this upstairs where Ivy was still fragile. She carried herself like a doctor who understands that truth can be a trauma all by itself. I could tell she was thinking what I was thinking. Ivy's body was finally resting, but her nervous system was still on a knife's edge. Truth has timing, and timing is part of care. I looked at Declan and saw something I hadn't seen before, not clearly. His protection wasn't sentimental. It was strategic, but it was real. He was already doing threat calculus in his head, and Ivy had become the center of it. If this fire was tied to a rival, Ivy wasn't just a survivor. She was a loose end, a living contradiction to a clean official story, and that meant she could be in danger again. If someone already tried to erase Ivy once, what stops them from trying again? I thought about Onyx upstairs, the way he'd placed his body between her and the world, the way he watched every breath, every movement. Earlier I'd thought it was bonding, grief, memory. Now it looked like guarding, not because the dog understood real estate or rival politics, because he understood threat, because his instincts were screaming the same message Declan's intelligence network was starting to confirm. The world outside these gates isn't safe for her. The truth versus timing dilemma tightened around my ribs. Ivy deserved to know what happened to her parents. She deserved a real story, not a blank space where adults avoid her eyes. But she also deserved to heal first, to feel safe in her own skin again before anyone handed her a new reason to be afraid. I realized I was already thinking like Ivy's advocate, not like a hired nurse, not like a woman counting hours to payday, like a mother. Declan's machine kept moving. I watched him make quiet calls, no raised voice, no drama, just a chain of actions that triggered other actions. A trusted investigator pulled deeper records. Someone requested the full fire scene file, not the summary. Another person flagged the development company's other purchases like they were building a map. Staff moved with new protocols, doors locked that hadn't been locked earlier, extra guards positioned in silent places, cameras adjusted. The fortress wasn't just watching now, it was preparing, and I felt the uneasy truth of it. I was safer inside his control, and that safety came from the same power that frightened me. A part of me hated that. Another part of me, practical, exhausted, maternal, didn't care. It just wanted Ivy alive. When I finally turned to go back upstairs, the plan was already taking shape in the air around us. Not announced. Assembled. Like Declan was shifting from caretaker by circumstance to protector by intention. But protection in the real world isn't just muscle and gates. It's paperwork. It's legal strategy. It's keeping a child off the radar while you hunt for the truth. And I could feel the next battle coming. One that wouldn't be fought with teeth in a courtyard, but with custody, discretion, and moral lines that would get blurry fast. Because if the sanctuary fire was arson, then Ivy wasn't just recovering from neglect. She was recovering inside a war she didn't even know she was part of. And the next question wasn't only how to keep her warm tonight. It was how to keep her safe tomorrow without letting the system that already buried her once get the chance to do it again. Declan's study didn't feel like a room meant for living. It felt like a room meant for decisions, dark wood, clean lines, a desk that looked more like a command surface than furniture. Even the lighting was controlled, aimed downward so nothing dramatic happened by accident. When I stepped inside, I could still smell Ivy's room on my clothes. Warm blankets, antiseptic wipes, the faint animal clean scent of Onyx's fur. It was a weird contrast, like I'd carried a little pocket of childhood into a place that had never made space for it. Harper was already there, posture straight, hands steady, the same calm she used at a bedside. Only now the bedside was a legal problem with teeth. Upstairs, Ivy was finally sleeping like her body trusted the room. Onyx stayed close, pressed along the bed as if he could block nightmares with his ribs. That image kept flashing in my mind as we stood around Declan's desk, because it made the stakes feel simple even when the reality wasn't. The problem was brutally clear. Ivy didn't exist on paper. She wasn't just undocumented in a normal way. She was documented as dead. That meant any official move, hospital intake, Social services, a standard missing child report could trigger alarms in systems that treat inconsistencies like threats. And if the fire had been engineered, if people had benefited from Ivy being erased, then the worst thing we could do was announce to the world that she'd returned. The whole situation made my stomach twist. I'd spent years telling myself rules matter, paperwork matters. The system is flawed, but it's the system. Now the system was part of what had buried her. Declan's strategy came out in pieces, not as a speech. He laid out options the way he probably laid out territory maps: fast, practical, focused on minimizing exposure, a controlled narrative, a tight circle of care, a legal pathway that could be moved quickly with influence and the right professionals. I could see what he was aiming for even without him spelling it out. If Ivy couldn't safely enter the system, then he'd build a safe lane that ran alongside it. Something semi-legal, maybe fully legal later, but immediately protective now. A guardianship framework that kept Ivy under one roof, one medical team, one set of trusted eyes while he dug into the arson thread and figured out who had reason to erase her. Part of me understood the logic so well it scared me. Because it worked the way his world worked. Control first, clean up later. Harper didn't let that slide unchallenged. Her whole presence shifted into boundary-setting mode. Not hostile, just immovable. She carried the child-first argument the way a doctor carries a pulse check, non-negotiable, basic, essential. She made it clear, through her tone and the way she held eye contact, that Ivy's life couldn't be built on manipulation without consequences. She needed stability that wasn't just physical safety. She needed therapy, schooling, routine. The right to grow up without learning that lying is the price of being protected. And she pushed on the part that made my skin prickle too. If Declan wrote Ivy's story for her, even with good intentions, he'd be making himself the center of her life, in a way no adult should. Who gets to decide what best interest means when power is involved? I stood between them and felt my own conflict sharpen. I understood Declan's fear of exposure. I'd seen what happens when the wrong file gets opened in the wrong office. I'd seen families separated because a form was filled out correctly at the worst possible moment. And Ivy's connection to Onyx wasn't a cute preference. It was her anchor. Splitting her from him right now could break her in a way nobody would see on a chart. At the same time, Harper was right. Completely right. I'd lived long enough in survival mode to know that shortcuts have a cost, and kids always pay it later. I thought of Eli again, how I've fought for his care inside normal systems, how I've begged and negotiated and signed paperwork until my wrist cramped. I thought about how hard I'd worked to keep his life clean, not hidden, and Ivy's life had been forced into hiding before she ever had a choice. Can you protect a child with a lie if the truth might get her killed? That question sat in my chest like a stone. Declan's solution started to take shape as something more structured than a cover-up, and that mattered. He wasn't talking about making Ivy disappear. He was talking about keeping her safe while building a legitimate path forward, one that didn't trigger the same forces that might still be circling. He was willing to bring in a legal team quietly. He was willing to establish a temporary guardianship arrangement that could hold in a gray zone, while Harper monitored Ivy's medical recovery and documented what she could without broadcasting it. He was willing to create rules inside the house that made it possible for Ivy to be a child in a place built for adults with weapons. That's where the moral battle turned into practical boundaries. I watched Harper press for clear lines. Ivy shouldn't see Declan's business. She shouldn't hear violence in the halls. She shouldn't be treated like a pawn or a mascot. Access to her room should be limited. Staff should be vetted. Visitors should be non-existent. If she stayed, the fortress had to change shape around her. And the shocking thing was, Declan didn't dismiss it. He didn't look pleased, but he accepted the constraints like he understood the logic. Like he knew that if Ivy was to survive long-term, he couldn't just lock her behind gates and call it safety. He'd have to build a childhood inside his walls. Harper's involvement became the spine of the plan. Not optional, not decorative, a watchdog with credentials and conscience, staying close enough to protect Ivy from both the system and Declan's impulse to solve everything with control. Declan accepted her presence for another reason too, and I could see it. Ivy trusted Harper in a way she didn't trust him yet. Onyx allowed Harper. Those were facts even a powerful man couldn't override. Then my part slid into place, whether I wanted it or not. I offered what I could offer. Continuity. A familiar face, a normal world perspective, the ability to notice when a kid is shutting down, when she's masking, when she's doing the brave thing because she thinks adults can't handle her truth. But I also felt my own line rise up inside me, clear and sharp. I could help medically. I could help emotionally. I could help Harper keep Ivy stable. I could not be part of anything that hurt Ivy for the sake of convenience. No dirty stories that make her the problem. No paperwork games that erase her needs. No choices that treat her trauma like collateral damage. Declan studied me when that line became visible, even without words. His gaze held that same intense focus I'd seen in the security room. But there was something else underneath it, an awareness that I wasn't one of his people, and I wasn't afraid to say no. That should have made me feel powerful. Instead, it made me feel exposed, because I could sense his gravity even in this, how he pulled situations into orbit, how he made others react, how he turned chaos into structure. And I hated that some part of me respected it. Hated that some part of me felt a strange, reluctant steadiness standing near him, like the world was less likely to collapse if he was in the room. Then came a quieter turning point, small, almost invisible. Declan's posture shifted, just slightly, like the weight of this responsibility had found a place to sit on him. He didn't confess feelings the way normal people do, but I could tell he was acknowledging something he hadn't planned for, that this wasn't just strategy anymore. Ivy was changing the math, because protecting a child isn't the same as protecting territory. You can't solve it with intimidation. You can't buy your way out of grief, and you can't afford to fail, because the cost of failure is a kid's life. That reality had gotten under his skin. It had gotten under mine, too. By the time the plan settled, temporary guardianship path, controlled medical documentation, therapy lined up quietly, strict house rules, Harper as advocate, me as continuity, I felt a cautious kind of hope. Not because it was perfect, because it was something. A bridge, built in the dark, over a drop we couldn't see the bottom of yet. And then, as if the house wanted to remind us who this was really about, I heard the soft pad of footsteps in the hallway outside the study. A pause. A small presence hovering near the door like someone trying to be brave about interrupting adults. My chest tightened. Ivy was awake enough to wander, or half awake enough to search for her anchors. I could already imagine what her eyes would do, how they'd flick to Onyx, then to Harper, then to Declan, trying to figure out whether this man in the fortress was a threat or a shelter. And I could feel the question coming, the one no child should have to ask, but children like Ivy always do in one form or another. Not a legal question. A moral one. Something like, is he safe? Is he good? Am I going to be sent away again? I took a slow breath and started toward the door, because I knew the next few minutes would define everything we'd just planned. It wouldn't be decided by paperwork. It would be decided by what Declan did when a child looked at him and needed an answer she could feel in her bones. It was late enough that the mansion didn't feel like a mansion anymore. It felt like a shelter someone forgot to name. The hall lights were dimmed. The loud parts of the house, security feeds, radios, doors had gone quiet on purpose. Even the air felt warmer now, like the fortress had decided to stop performing and start protecting. Ivy stood in the doorway of the study for a second, small and unsteady, wrapped in a blanket that swallowed her shoulders. Onyx was right there beside her, close enough that his flank brushed her leg with every breath. He moved like he was tethered to her, not a guard dog, not a weapon, an anchor. Harper reached her first, guiding her back toward the guest suite without crowding her. I followed, and I could feel Declan behind us, present, controlled, careful not to make the hallway feel like a trap. Back in the room, Ivy didn't climb fully into the bed at first. She hovered near it like she didn't trust softness yet. Her eyes moved from Harper to me, then to Declan, and finally back to Onyx, as if she needed his body to translate what the adults were saying. And then the question came, not as a long sentence, not as an accusation. It came in the child's simple way that can cut straight through grown-up logic. Ivy's face tightened, her fingers curling into Onyx's fur, and she tried to understand the future in one breath, whether she was going to be taken away again, and whether the man who owned this fortress was safe. It wasn't a courtroom question. It was a bedtime question. Am I staying? Are you good? Are you going to let them separate me from him? My throat went tight because I knew what she was really asking. She wasn't asking if Declan had ever hurt anyone. She was asking if he would hurt her. If he would choose his comfort over her safety. If he would treat her like a problem to be managed, instead of a kid to be cared for. Declan didn't answer like a man trying to sound righteous. He didn't reach for a perfect line. He did something more convincing. He gave up control in front of her. I watched him signal his staff to step back. Watched him make space, literally and emotionally, so Ivy wouldn't feel surrounded. He moved slower than he had all night, like he was letting her nervous system lead the room. He made it clear without turning it into a speech that nobody was taking her anywhere tonight, that Onyx wasn't being removed, that this wasn't a negotiation. His commitment showed up in actions that cost him something. He accepted Harper's presence as non-optional oversight, the kind that limits a man like him. He accepted my involvement too, the normal world witness he couldn't fully control. He let the plan we'd built in the study hold its shape even under Ivy's frightened stare. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He didn't ask to be trusted blindly. He made a choice in real time. Ivy's safety over his convenience. Ivy's stability over his image. Ivy and Onyx together, even if it complicated everything. Harper reinforced it with her whole posture. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just firm. She stayed close to Ivy's bed like a steady wall, and made it clear she wasn't leaving this child alone inside a powerful man's house without accountability. Her calm carried a promise. Ivy would have an advocate, not a handler. And Declan accepted it. That acceptance told me more than any apology could. Ivy watched all of this with the seriousness of someone who has learned that adults can say anything. Her body didn't relax because she believed in goodness. It relaxed because it recognized a pattern. The room wasn't closing in. No one was grabbing her. Onyx wasn't being dragged away. Harper wasn't being pushed out. For the first time all night, Ivy's breathing slowed. Her grip on Onyx's fur loosened just a little, not letting go, but easing, like her hands were finally allowed to unclench. She sank onto the edge of the bed, then leaned into the warmth like her bones had been waiting for permission to be tired. That was the proof moment for me. Not a signature on a form, not a plan on a desk. A child deciding she could rest. I stood there and felt something settle inside my chest, something like a vow forming without words. The world had already vanished Ivy once. It had stamped her into silence and moved on. I wasn't going to do that. I didn't know what the next weeks would look like. Therapy would be slow. School would be complicated. The legal plan would be messy. Declan's investigation into the fire would keep moving. And danger didn't disappear just because a child found a bed. But one miracle had already happened. Ivy wasn't alone anymore. Her family didn't look like a brochure. It looked like this. A girl with her hand on a dog who remembered. A doctor with a spine made of ethics. A single mom who came for a paycheck and stayed because motherhood doesn't let you unsee certain things. And a powerful man learning that being in charge isn't the same as being good. Because goodness isn't a label. It's a pattern of choices, especially when you have power and the easy option is right there. And maybe Onyx knew that first. Maybe that's why he changed in the courtyard. Maybe he recognized the one thing Ivy had left. Loyalty. I looked at Declan one more time. Not with romance. Not with trust. But with the kind of honest curiosity that comes when a story shifts under your feet. Do you think a person can become good? If a child believes they can? If this story moved you, hit like and share it with someone who'd feel it too. And I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away? Or stayed and risked everything for a kid the world already gave up on?